What defines who you really are? The past that shaped you or the choices you make today? Ethan Brooks stared out the window of his Times Square office, the reflection of neon lights dancing in his lifeless eyes. Another contract closed, another goal achieved. He pressed the tip of his Montblanc pen against the oak desk as the echo of silence enveloped him, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. His assistant's voice came over the intercom, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Brooks, the schedule is full until Christmas Eve. Would you like to confirm tomorrow's dinner with the council?" Ethan sighed, feeling the weight of yet another purposeless commitment. "No, cancel. There is no need to waste time on formalities," he replied sharply. Across town, Claire Bennett adjusted the decorations at the school's entrance, smiling as she helped children hang garlands made from colorful paper. The sound of children's laughter and the melody of an old Christmas carol filled the chilly air. She took a step back, watching the result with satisfaction. "Perfect," she told herself, before being interrupted by a message on her phone. It was a warning from the community association. Fundraising for the local orphanage was far below expectations. Claire frowned, feeling the weight of responsibility in her chest. "We need to do something more. We cannot leave these children without a worthy Christmas." While Claire was lost in plans to increase donations, Ethan moved his chair away with a sudden movement. He left the office and walked through the company's corridors, ignoring the employees' greetings. His expression was closed as always, but the whispers that echoed around him did not go unnoticed. "I heard he never celebrates Christmas. I bet you don't even know what a real tree is." He didn't mind. For Ethan, Christmas was just another distraction, a time he used to increase profits while others relaxed. Back at school, Claire walked to the local market, an idea pulsing through her mind. A public campaign, something that could attract the attention of business people and philanthropists. As she passed a window decorated with flashing lights and a smiling Santa Claus, she saw her reflection and adjusted the collar of her coat. "We'll make it," she whispered to herself. His determination was the spark that guided everything he did. That night, as Ethan was reviewing numbers on his laptop, his connection to the real world was interrupted by a video call from his grandfather. Even through the screen, the elder Brooks emanated an aura of authority tempered with humor. "Ethan, there's something we need to talk about before the year ends. Something important." Ethan raised his eyebrow, intrigued. "Important for whom?" he asked with a tone of disinterest. "For you. It's time to understand what it means to build something that really matters." Ethan ended the call with a sigh, thinking it was another one of his grandfather's preachings. However, he didn't know that this conversation would be the beginning of a change that would shake the foundations of his perfect, calculated life. Meanwhile, Claire wrote frantically on a notepad, listing names of potential donors, her eyes shining with hope and her head full of ideas. And so, New York City, with its twinkling lights and its promises of Christmas miracles, began to bring two opposing worlds together, setting the stage for a meeting that would change everything. Claire woke up early that morning, the biting December cold seeping through the cracks in the windows of her small apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. Despite the heat coming from the old stove, as she poured water for her coffee, she felt the weight of a worry that refused to dissipate. The message about low fundraising for the Christmas campaign was like a stone in his chest. The children needed those donations, not just for the gifts, but for the promise that the world had not forgotten them. Leaning against the kitchen counter, Claire glanced at the clock. There was still time to get help. She remembered the big event the school was planning with sponsors from the city, and, once again, she felt that thread of hope intertwining with anxiety. "Claire, you can do it. It's not the first time you've faced something like this." The thought comforted her, but the voice trembled a little in her mind, a weakness she hated to admit. In Times Square, Ethan Brooks faced a room full of lawyers and board members, the panoramic windows displaying the organized chaos of the city below. He felt trapped, as if the opulence and glitter around him were a golden cage. As his family's lawyer adjusted his glasses and presented the clause in his grandfather's will, Ethan crossed his arms, his face a mask of indifference. "That's ridiculous," he said. his voice full of irritation. "It's not ridiculous," replied the lawyer with a firmness that few dared to use with Ethan. "Your grandfather believes you need a greater purpose. Prove that you can build real connections." Ethan suppressed a dry laugh, but the weight of the words lingered. Real connections. He no longer knew what that meant, if he ever did. The lawyer continued, mentioning that Ethan had until Christmas Eve to introduce a partner and prove that he had started to change. Otherwise, he would lose not only his inheritance, but also control over the company. When the meeting ended, Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the city's twinkling lights. The echo of laughter and the distant murmur of employees in the hallway did not penetrate the silence. For a moment, he felt a strange weight in his chest, a mixture of anger and discomfort. He hated being manipulated, even by someone he loved like his grandfather. Hours later, on the way to a company-sponsored community event, Ethan got into his car with a neutral expression, but his insides were a whirlwind of thoughts. If that's what the old man wants, he thought, I'll show him that no one sets the rules for me. At the event, Claire walked around the place with a smile that disguised her uneasiness. The square was decorated with Christmas lights and stalls selling hot chocolate and handmade decorations. She carried a notepad, approaching sponsors with enthusiasm and a hint of nervousness hidden in her voice. That's when Ethan entered the venue, followed by his PR team. He looked out of place, but his gaze quickly found Claire. She was helping a child tie a colorful scarf, her laughter echoing softly between the stalls. Something about that scene caught his attention, a sincerity he couldn't explain. Ethan approached, his posture confident, but his heart carried an unusual hesitation. Claire, upon noticing the well-dressed man and the aura of authority that surrounded him, felt momentarily intimidated, but smiled politely. When he coldly and directly explained his proposal of fake relationship in exchange for substantial sponsorship, Claire froze. Her first reaction was to reject it, almost angrily, but at the same time, she thought about the children and how much the donation could change their lives. His eyes met Ethan's, searching for any clue that he was joking. When she realized she wasn't, the feeling of being tested by fate took over her. "I'm not that kind of person, Ethan Brooks," she said, trying to control her voice. "And I'm not the kind of person to ask for help," he replied, with disconcerting honesty. There was a moment of silence, the smell of cinnamon and hot chocolate mixed with the chill in the air, as Claire looked at the pad in her hands, feeling the weight of her decision. Ethan left her with his assistant's number and a deadline for his response. When he left, Claire felt torn, her mind a whirlwind of questions. Who was he really? What did he really want? And why did something inside her seem to say that accepting him could change more than the children's Christmas? Claire held the phone as if it were made of thin glass, her fingertips trembling slightly as she looked at the number Ethan Brooks had left. The night had been long, but his thoughts had given him no rest since the moment he proposed that strange agreement. A fake relationship? She laughed humorlessly, shaking her head as if trying to dispel a lingering fog. Who does this? And why me? Across town, Ethan sat on a leather sofa in the minimalist living room of his luxury apartment, the lights of New York twinkling outside. He was tightening the knot on his already loosened tie as he reviewed the day's events. The memory of Claire's look, divided between indignation and something he couldn't decipher, hovered in his mind like a song he couldn't forget. An ordinary woman, but so firm. Ethan realized it was a quality he didn't often encounter in the circles he lived in. The next morning, Claire made her decision. The phone felt warm against her ear as she waited for Ethan's assistant to answer. When she did, she heard her own voice ring out steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I accept, but with conditions." When Claire entered the bright lobby of Ethan's company building, she felt the weight of opulence crushing her sense of belonging. Everything seemed designed to intimidate: the cold lights, the impeccable marble floors, the muffled sound of scurrying professionals' footsteps. As she waited to be called into Ethan's office, she smoothed her skirt and gripped the strap of her bag tightly, as if that would steady the nerves dancing in her stomach. Ethan welcomed her into his office with the same expressionless expression, but his eyes studied her with curiosity. Claire noticed that there was something disarming about that look, as if he were always assessing the world and the people around him with a mix of interest and skepticism. "Let's be clear," Claire began, before he could say anything. "This isn't about money for me. It's about the children. If you're not committed to doing your part, we're not going anywhere." Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the direct tone. He expected hesitation or even deference, but Claire wasn't about to give ground. "I keep my promises," he replied, his voice controlled. "But I expect the same from you." The agreement was signed with an exchange of handshakes, but discomfort hovered between them. Ethan saw Claire as a piece on the board that he needed to manipulate to achieve his goals, while Claire saw herself as someone trying to make the best of a situation she never chose. The first interactions between them were marked by tension. The introduction dinner, hosted at an expensive restaurant with other members of Ethan's circle, was a silent battle of looks and words. Claire, sitting among well-dressed businessmen and their bejeweled wives, felt like an extra in an elite theater. One of the guests, an older man with a condescending smile, asked Claire what her occupation was. "Teacher," she replied, lifting her chin, aware of the way he rolled his eyes slightly before changing the subject. Ethan noticed, and something inside him twitched. Later, as they waited for the car in the bitter cold of the night, Claire couldn't help herself. "Is that what you call a social circle? People who only see others as numbers or tools?" Ethan laughed, but without humor. "Welcome to my world, Claire, and maybe you should get used to it if we're going to keep this up." She crossed her arms, the cold air hitting her cheeks like needles. "Maybe you should think about finding better people." The silence between them was thick, but something about the way Ethan's eyes followed her as she got into the car suggested he was considering her words more than he let on. That night, Ethan revisited Claire's comment while looking at an old photo album his grandfather had left in his apartment. He found himself staring at a Christmas photo from years ago, when there was still a light of hope in his eyes and his grandfather was smiling beside him. Maybe he was right to challenge me, he thought, but he dismissed the thought almost immediately. He had no time for sentimental reflections. Claire, on the other hand, was sitting on her bed with a notepad, scribbling down ideas for using Ethan's contribution in a meaningful way. She felt that the fake relationship was not just a business arrangement, but something that would somehow push her to confront parts of herself that she had avoided for years. And so the two continued on their parallel paths, forced to face not only their differences, but also the echoes of what was missing in their own lives. The muffled sound of horns and the frantic blinking of Times Square lights contrasted with the serenity inside the small cafe, where Claire leafed through a donation catalog as she waited for Ethan. It was their third meeting to plan their joint story, and each one seemed more challenging than the last. She looked out the window, watching the constant movement of people, while a cup of hot chocolate slowly cooled in her hands. The bell on the cafe door rang, and she knew immediately that he had arrived. Ethan Brooks was not a man who went unnoticed, even in a city full of unique figures. His impeccable coat and upright posture exuded authority, but there was something in his eyes that Claire was beginning to recognize, a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation, as if he wasn't sure where he really fit. "It's late," she commented, without taking her eyes off the catalog. "Business, Claire. They don't fit in with our little get-togethers." There was a slight sarcasm in his voice, but Claire just rolled her eyes and pointed to the chair in front of her. "Sit down. We need to talk about the charity event." Ethan complied, although his discomfort was evident. He had never been directly involved in community initiatives, and the idea of attending such a simple event made him uneasy. As Claire explained the details, an afternoon with the orphanage children, handmade decorations, and modest gifts collected with difficulty, Ethan tried to hide his disbelief. "That's basic," he said finally, crossing his arms. "Why not something bigger? A gala event, perhaps?" Claire sighed, closing the catalog with an irritated gesture. "Because what children need is closeness, human warmth, not a night full of people pretending to care while taking photos for social media." The comment made her blush slightly, realizing that perhaps she had been too harsh. But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he looked at the closed catalog and did something unexpected. He reached out to open it again. "Show me how this works," he said, his voice lower and without sarcasm. Claire hesitated, but began to explain. To her surprise, he asked questions, Not the superficial kind, but genuine ones. Trying to understand why the little things like decorations made by the children themselves were so important. That afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the orphanage with Claire, something he would never have imagined doing before. The old building was decorated with twinkling lights and a simple Christmas tree adorned with paper ornaments and popcorn chains. When they entered, they were greeted by children running and laughter echoing through the hallways. Claire seemed in her element. She bent down to speak to a small girl holding a pot of paint, praising the decorations she was creating. Ethan watched from afar, uncomfortable. He didn't know how to interact with children and felt out of place in a place so full of life and disorder. "Are you Aunt Claire's boyfriend?" asked a boy, tugging on Ethan's coat sleeve. Ethan's face hardened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Something like that," he replied, his voice coming out gentler than he expected. The boy laughed and pointed to a corner where Claire was helping other children put together a gingerbread house. "She's cool. You are lucky." Ethan looked at Claire, realizing that she truly was unlike anyone he had ever met. There was a light about her, an energy that seemed to illuminate even the darkest corners of the place. For a brief moment, he felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. Envy? Admiration? When Claire approached with a smile, he realized he had been standing there longer than he should have. "Come on, Mr. Brooks," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "We have a gingerbread house to decorate." Ethan couldn't help but smile, something rare for him. In the following days, the two spent more time together, whether planning the event or discussing their differences of opinion on almost everything. But as the conversations progressed, the barriers began to fall. Claire discovered that Ethan had a dry sense of humor and that he observed the world with a curiosity she hadn't expected. Ethan, in turn, realized that Claire had more layers than he realized of fierce determination, but also moments of doubt that she carefully hid. One night, as they were leaving a meeting, Ethan suggested something surprising. "Maybe we can improve the event with some surprises, something that really marks the lives of these children." Claire raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Like what?" "Leave it to me," he replied, with an enigmatic smile. She didn't know what to expect, but for the first time she felt like Ethan was starting to understand. Ethan's company event hall was packed. Golden lights reflected off the crystals that hung from huge chandeliers, and the soft music of a string quartet filled the room. Claire was leaning against a table decorated with arrangements of white and red flowers, watching people chatting animatedly while smiling in a practiced way. It was the company's Christmas event, organized as a public relations strategy and also as an essential step towards the agreement between her and Ethan. She sucked in air slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders. Her dress was elegant, something Ethan had chosen, and that, despite being beautiful, made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. The overwhelming presence of the business elite seemed to surround her like a wall. Ethan appeared at her side, impeccable in his black suit. He looked comfortable, in control, but when his eyes met Claire's, there was a shadow of something else: concern, perhaps. "Are you well?" he asked, keeping his voice low so no one around would hear. Claire gave a short, but not genuine, smile. "This is different from what I'm used to, but I'm trying." Ethan nodded. He knew she felt out of place, and something inside him wanted to ease that feeling. But before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Oh, Ethan, who is this?" A tall, sophisticated woman, wearing a dress that seemed to be made of diamonds, approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Claire politely introduced herself, but sensed the woman's veiled hostility, especially when she cast an appraising glance in her direction. "A teacher? Interesting," the woman commented, as if she were talking about something trivial. Ethan quickly interrupted, diverting the conversation, but Claire felt her blood boil. She hated the feeling of being evaluated and discarded so quickly, as if she wasn't worthy of being there. Later that night, as the guests dispersed and the event drew to a close, Claire decided to step outside for a moment to breathe. The cold December air enveloped her like relief, washing away the feeling of suffocation that had accompanied her all night. She heard Ethan's footsteps before she saw him. He appeared at her side, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "I thought you might want one." "I'm not a big fan," she replied, looking at the city lights. Ethan placed the glass on the nearest table and leaned on the railing next to it. I know today was difficult. Claire turned to him, crossing her arms. Difficult is not the word. I think I prefer humiliating. The sincerity of her response made Ethan raise his eyebrows. He wasn't used to someone being so direct with him. You knew it would be like this, Claire. It's not my world that needs to change. She felt a pang in her chest, something between anger and sadness. And maybe that's the problem, Ethan. You think your world is the only one that matters. Ethan hesitated. For the first time, he seemed speechless. Claire shook her head and started to walk away, but he grabbed her arm, his voice carrying something close to despair. I didn't mean that. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Claire saw the confusion in his eyes, but at that moment, she was too hurt to care. In the following days, tension between them grew. Ethan was more reserved, as if he was processing something he couldn't articulate, while Claire immersed herself in her work with the children, trying to distance herself from the pain she felt. Then, at lunch with Claire, Ethan's lawyer showed up unexpectedly, bringing documents for him to review. Claire, distracted by a report on the donation drive, barely noticed the exchange. But when she heard the words inheritance and clause, she stopped. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Ethan sign the papers without looking at her. Something was wrong, and she felt a chill run down her spine. What does that mean? She asked after the lawyer left. Ethan hesitated, but then he saw the look on Claire's face and knew he couldn't escape. He reluctantly explained that their relationship was part of a condition imposed by his grandfather. Claire listened silently, but her mind was in a whirl. The pieces fit together in a cruel way. The dinner, the event, everything was part of a plan. When Ethan finished speaking, she slowly stood up, as if trying to avoid breaking something inside her. So I'm just a pawn in your game, she said, her voice low but full of repressed emotion. Claire, it's not like that. No, because it feels exactly like that. She grabbed her things and left without looking back. Ethan stood there, feeling a pain he didn't know how to name. For the first time, he realized he was missing something that really mattered, and he didn't know if he could fix it. Ethan Brooks sat in his office, surrounded by windows that offered a stunning view of Times Square. But for the first time, he saw nothing but a reflection of his own confusion. The city below seemed distant, a muffled echo of life and movement that could not reach their isolated world. The space, normally so organized and controlled, now felt suffocating. His mind kept returning to Claire's expression before leaving the restaurant. The tone of her voice, mixed with disappointment and something that sounded dangerously close to pain, kept echoing in his head. He knew he had lied by omission, but he didn't expect the truth to hurt her so much. Ethan sighed, running his hands through his hair. He was used to solving problems with logic and precision, but Claire was an equation he simply couldn't solve. Worse still, he wasn't sure he wanted to solve it. Maybe for once, he just wanted to understand her. Claire was in her classroom, but her mind was miles away. The children were painting Christmas cards, their laughter and chatter echoing happily around the room, but she could barely concentrate. Her mind kept returning to her conversation with Ethan. The frustration she had felt had given way to a deeper pain, a sense of betrayal that she couldn't ignore. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths to try and compose herself. It wasn't just the fact that he had used the relationship as part of a deal. That's what it meant. Could it be that for Ethan, nothing had value unless it was transactional? She wondered if he had ever experienced something genuine, something that didn't involve an exchange or a contract. When he opened his eyes again, he saw one of the girls from the orphanage holding a card with a simple phrase, "Thank you for taking care of us." Claire smiled, even though her heart was still heavy. Later that night, Ethan made an impulsive decision. He picked up the phone and, without allowing his usual reasoning to stop him, called Claire. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He tried again, but the result was the same. Feeling defeated, he walked to his window and looked out at the twinkling lights of the city. Suddenly, an idea popped into his mind. Something Claire had said at the orphanage days before echoed in her thoughts. Children just need human warmth, something real. He knew where she would be. At the orphanage, Claire was organizing presents for the Christmas event, but her body seemed to be running on autopilot. When he heard footsteps behind him, he turned and froze. Ethan was there, standing at the entrance, with an expression that mixed hesitation and determination. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. Ethan took a step forward, but kept enough distance so as not to invade her space. "I came to apologize." Claire raised her eyebrows, crossing her arms. "If this is what you think will fix everything, I suggest you save your energy." He shook his head, as if acknowledging the validity of her response. "I don't expect to fix everything, Claire, but I want to try to explain." She was silent, and he continued, choosing his words carefully. "You were right. I've lived my whole life seeing people as tools. I thought it was the only way to survive in the world I grew up in. But you showed me there's another way, and I don't want to lose that." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him, but the emotional scar was still fresh. "And how do I know you're being sincere now?" Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on hers. "Because, for once, I care. Not with what I can earn, but with what I can do to be someone you can trust." The silence between them was thick, but something in Ethan's eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before, began to soften the wall Claire had erected. Over the next few days, Ethan began to become more deeply involved with the orphanage, not just to impress Claire, but because he began to understand the impact small gestures could have. He organized a surprise for the children, a huge Christmas tree, decorated with ornaments handmade by him and Claire, and a Santa Claus hired to hand out gifts. When Claire arrived and saw the scene, something inside her broke, not with pain, but with relief. She saw the children running and laughing, genuine joy on their faces. And in the middle of it all, Ethan, kneeling next to a child, helping her open a gift with a smile she had never seen before. She approached slowly, and he looked up, meeting her eyes. "I just wanted them to have something special," he said, almost in a whisper. Claire felt the tears come before she could stop them. Maybe he still had a lot to learn, but in that moment, she saw there was something genuine about Ethan Brooks, something she never expected to find. Snow fell gently over the city, covering New York with a white blanket that seemed to soften the frenetic pace of the end of the year. The orphanage was silent that morning, the heat inside contrasting with the biting cold outside. Claire watched the Christmas tree decorated by the children and Ethan, each ornament hanging with a story of its own. A mixed feeling filled his heart: joy at the positive impact he had made there, but also uncertainty about the future. Ethan was late, and Claire didn't know why. Something about this made her uneasy. He had been so present the last few days, involved in every detail, that his absence felt out of place, like a missing piece of a puzzle. Across town, Ethan was in his old childhood apartment, a place he had avoided for years. It was small, dark, and every corner seemed to murmur memories of a time he had buried. He held a photo album in his hands, the pages filled with yellowed images that captured moments that, at the time, seemed insignificant. But now, looking at his grandfather's smile in those photos, he felt something different. Ethan never talked about his childhood. Few people knew that his parents had died in an accident when he was a child, leaving him in the care of his grandfather. The man who raised him was strict, demanding, but also deeply generous, something Ethan was only now beginning to realize. "You knew what you were doing all along, didn't you?" he murmured, flipping through the pages. The will, the clause, everything was part of a lesson that grandfather was trying to teach. When Ethan arrived at the orphanage, it was late, but Claire was still there, organizing donations that had arrived earlier. She looked up when she saw him enter, her expression a mixture of relief and slight irritation. "I thought you had given up on helping," she said, with a tone that hid the concern she had felt. Ethan stood in the doorway, the snow slowly melting off his coat. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking, her voice loaded with something Claire could not identify. "We need to talk." She immediately realized that something was different. He looked more vulnerable, as if carrying a weight he had finally decided to share. "All good. I'm listening," she said, placing the boxes on her side and turning to him. Ethan started slowly, as if each word required effort. He told about his childhood, about the loss of his parents, and how his grandfather had filled that emptiness with rules and expectations. He talked about how he grew up believing that love was conditioned to achievements. Claire heard in silence, every word of him resonating in a corner of her heart that she did not expect to open. When he finally stopped, there was a heavy silence between them, full of unvised emotions. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked, with her voice smoother than she wanted. Ethan stepped ahead, his eyes finding hers. "Because you are the first person who made me want to be more than that. More than a sum of rules and contracts." Claire felt her tears forming, but she flashed quickly, trying to keep the composure. "Ethan," he held her hands, something he had never done before. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for everything. I just want you to know that, for the first time, I understand what it really means to care." She saw the sincerity in her eyes, something that completely disarmed her. But there was also fear, afraid that trusting him could leave her vulnerable again. "I need time, Ethan," she finally said, her voice shaking slightly. He nodded, giving her hands reluctantly. "I'll be here whenever you're ready." Later that night, Claire sat on her small living room, surrounded by silence. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, along with the memory of his gaze, so loaded with emotions that she almost felt as if she could touch them. She thought of the children of the orphanage, how Ethan had changed in recent days, showing one side of him that seemed so far from the man she had known at the beginning. But was it enough? Had he really changed? Or was it just another part of a game she didn't understand? At the same time, Ethan was in his own apartment, looking out the window to the city's lights. He knew he had exposed himself in a way he had never done before, but felt that he had no choice. Claire was different, and he knew that if there was any chance of redemption, she would be the heart of it. The snow fell constantly that morning, covering the roofs and streets of New York with a silent white layer. Claire was slowly walking through the park near her home, thoughts weighing more than the cold that tried to freeze her cheeks. Each step in the snow seemed to echo your doubts. What Ethan had said the night before did not come out of his head. There was something in the way he had opened, the raw vulnerability in his voice that disarmed her. But fear remained. She knew what it was like to trust someone and be left in pieces. Even so, part of his heart seemed eager to believe he was being sincere. Maybe he really wanted to change. Maybe, only maybe, he really cared. In the center of the park, Claire found a snow-covered bench and quickly cleaned it with the gloves before sitting. In the distance, children laughed and ran, trying to capture snowflakes. The scene should warm her, but all she felt was a growing void. Meanwhile, Ethan was in the orphanage, an unusual expression on his face as he helped a girl hang decorations on the Christmas tree. She laughed when he raised her in the air to reach a higher branch, and the sound of her laugh seemed to dissolve part of the weight he carried. The orphanage director watched the scene from afar, smiling before approaching. "You seem to be adapting well, Mr. Brooks." Ethan looked at her, surprised for a moment, before returning the smile, though a little hesitant. "I think I'm learning some things." She studied him for a moment, leaning her head. Sometimes learning to give is harder than learning to receive. Ethan did not answer, but her words stayed with him while leaving later that day. He knew that if he wanted to regain Claire, he would need to show, and not just say, that he had changed. That night, Claire was in her kitchen, preparing a hot soup when she heard a knock on the door. Your heart accelerated immediately. She knew who she was even before opening. Ethan was there, holding a paper bag that exuded a delicious smell. "I thought you hadn't had dinner," he said, with a hesitant smile. She let him in, although he was not yet sure of the reason. As he put the food on the table, she crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "Why are you here, Ethan?" she asked, with a tired voice than she wanted. He stopped, looking at her with a sincerity that disarmed her. "Because I don't want you to think I'm giving up." She looked away, fighting the emotions that threatened to overflow. "What if I can never trust you again? Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that you can," he answered without hesitation. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if both were weighing what would come next, each trying to understand what the other really wanted. In the following days, Ethan continued to appear, not with great gestures, but with small and consistent actions. He offered to help Claire organize the children's gifts, appeared at the charity event, and even attended a community parade, wearing a ridiculous Christmas sweater that one of the children had insisted that he used. Claire began to notice the changes in him. He seemed less concerned about his image and more present, more willing to hear than to speak. It was as if he were rediscovering something he had lost a long time ago. But even with these gestures, Claire still felt the weight of uncertainty. One afternoon, as they walked together through the Christmas market, she stopped suddenly, looking at him with an intensity that made him stop too. "What happens after Christmas, Ethan?" He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She sighed, crossing her arms to protect herself from the cold. "After the deal is over, after you prove what you need to keep your inheritance, what happens to me?" Ethan took a deep breath, realizing the depth of the question. "Claire, I know I started it with wrong motives, but now all that matters to me is you." The words hovered between them, and Claire felt her heart squeeze. There was truth in her eyes, but she didn't know if it was enough to dispel her doubts. "I need time, Ethan," she said finally, with her voice low. He nodded, though the fear of losing her was clear in his expression. "I'll wait for the time you need." That night, Claire reflected on everything while sitting on her bed, looking at the flashy lights of the Christmas tree in her living room. Maybe she thought he was serious, but even so, she knew the way to trust him again would be long. And Ethan, alone in his apartment, knew there were no guarantees, but he also knew that for the first time he was willing to fight for something that really mattered. It was the morning of Christmas Eve, and New York was wrapped in a magic aura. The streets were covered by a soft snow, while bright garlands adorned poles and showcases. The orphanage was full of life, with children running, laughs echoing through the corridors, and the aroma of newly baked cookies filling the air. Claire was in the kitchen, helping the director organize the last details for this supper that would be held that night. But despite the festive scenario, his heart was restless. During the night before, as she looked at the tree in her living room, she had made a decision. Over the past few weeks, Ethan had shown one side of him that she never expected to see: vulnerable, present, genuine. But fear still grabbed her, whispering that trusting him could end up breaking her. What if everything were temporary? What if, in the end, would he return to the man he had known at the beginning? These questions spinned in his mind when he heard animated voices from the main hall. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked there, finding Ethan surrounded by children, helping them open donated toy boxes. He looked different. There was something lighter in her expression, a glow in her eyes she had never seen before. When his eyes crossed, he smiled in a way that made his heart hesitate. Later, while the children dozed off after lunch, Claire and Ethan went out to walk. The sharp cold made her noses red, but the comfortable silence between them was almost comforting. Finally, she broke the silence, suddenly stopping on the sidewalk. "Ethan, I need to know something." He turned to her, his hands stuck in his coat pockets. "Anything." She hesitated, fighting the knot that was formed in her throat. "Why did you stay, even after I said I needed time? Even knowing that I could never trust you again? Why did you keep trying?" Ethan took a deep breath, looking at the floor for a moment, before finding her gaze. "Because you made me realize that I was living in half, Claire. Before you, everything in my life was about control, goals, transactions. But you showed me that there is something else, something I didn't even know I wanted to find you." Claire felt her eyes fill with tears, but she flashed quickly, trying to keep the composure. "What if you lose your inheritance?" she asked, her smoother voice. Ethan shrugged, a sad smile on his lips. "It doesn't matter. I would do it all over again if I meant to have a chance with you." Meanwhile, in the orphanage, an unforeseen event threatened to destroy Christmas dinner. The supplier who had promised to deliver part of the food canceled at the last minute, and the director was panicked. When Ethan and Claire came back, she explained the situation with trembling hands. "The children expected so much for this. We can't disappoint them." Ethan wasted no time. He took the phone and started calling contacts, using his influence to get what was needed. Claire watched closely, surprised by how quickly he moved, his determination unshakable. Within a few hours, trucks arrived at the orphanage, full of additional food and gifts. Ethan supervised everything, making sure every detail was perfect. When the last box was discharged, he turned to Claire, the visible sweat on his forehead despite the cold. "It's all solved," he said, as if it were simple. Claire could not avoid. She approached him, and before she could think, wrapped him in a tight hug. Ethan was surprised for a moment, but then relaxed, involving her in her arms. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, the stuffy voice against his coat. "I would do anything for you," he answered, his voice loaded with emotion. That night, while the supper was happening, Claire sat next to Ethan, watching the children opening gifts and laughing. She looked at him, realizing how much he had changed. He was no longer the arrogant and calculating man he had met. He was someone who had learned the value of the small things, the real connections. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to trust. "Ethan, I want to try," she said, her voice low but firm. He turned to her, clear hope in his eyes. "To try?" She smiled, holding his hand. I want to try." The smile he gave in response was the most genuine she has ever seen. Christmas dawn covered New York with a soft golden light, reflecting on white snows that adorned the town's roofs. Times Square was calmer than normal, as if even the pulsating heart of the city decided to pause for a moment to celebrate. In the orphanage, the human warmth filled each corner. Claire woke up early, wrapped in the sound of soft laughs coming from the children's rooms. She wore a red sweater, decorated with snowflakes, and went down to the main room, where she found Ethan organizing gifts under the tree. He was on his back, but there was something in his posture that caught his attention, a relaxation she had not seen in him before. He was whistling a Christmas song, which made her smile. "I didn't know you whistled," she said, teasing him as he approached. Ethan turned. The smile that lit his face seemed brighter than any Christmas light. "I didn't know I knew how to do that," he replied, laughing softly. They spent the morning with the children, distributing gifts, laughing and sharing stories. Claire noticed how comfortable Ethan seemed at the floor to help a boy set up a set of building blocks, or listening carefully as a girl explained the drawing she had made for him. He was no longer the Ethan Brooks she had known weeks ago. He was more human, more present, more true. Later, when the children were busy with their new toys, Claire and Ethan decided to go for a walk. The fresh snow sprinkled under his feet as they walked side by side with an ice-covered park. The silence between them was comfortable, each lost in thoughts that somehow seemed to share. Finally, Ethan stopped. He turned to Claire, taking off his gloves to hold his icy hands between his. "There is something I need to say," he began, his voice low but firm. Claire looked at him, curious but quiet. "I don't know what the future reserves. I don't know how I will balance the man I went with the man I want to be. But I know that everything in me is shouting that you are the person I want by my side, no matter what happens." She felt her heart accelerate, but in a way that comforted her. She didn't scare her. "Ethan, you don't have to be perfect. You just need to be honest. With me, with yourself, and what you want for your life." He smiled, his eyes shining with something that seemed to be a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I never knew what it was like to have someone to believe in me." Claire smiled back, feeling a wave of heat through his body, despite the cold around. "Well, now you know." Later, they returned to the orphanage, where a simple but warm supper was being prepared. The children sang Christmas songs around the tree, while the director served hot chocolate for everyone. Ethan looked around, feeling something he could not explain. It was as if, for the first time, he was in a place where he actually belonged. He realized that it was not the wealth or power that made him feel complete, but people, the connections, the chance to be part of something larger than himself. When Claire approached, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate, he smiled at her, feeling that she didn't need to say anything. She seemed to understand. That night, after the children went to sleep, Claire and Ethan were alone in the living room, sitting on the couch in front of the fireplace. The tree shone gently in the corner, throwing delicate shadows on the walls. "So what happens now?" Claire asked, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. He was silent for a moment, looking at the flames dancing in the fireplace. Then he answered with a soft smile. "I think we find out together." She smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced a long time ago. The clock scored midnight, and the streets of New York shone with fireworks that illuminated the sky. The city seemed to be celebrating something more than just Christmas, as if celebrating new opportunities, new beginnings. Ethan held Claire's hand, intertwining her fingers in her own. He knew their journey was just beginning, and it wouldn't be perfect. But for the first time, he was not afraid. He felt hope,